Hey friend, tonight we are going to know how different dating and sex were in colonial America. So take a deep breath, settle yourself into a comforting space, dim the lights. Let's begin this journey together. When we think of colonial America, what often comes to mind are images of stern-faced Puritans buttoned up, tight clutching Bibles, and casting judgment on anything remotely pleasurable. But that's only part of the story. The colonies were a patchwork of cultures, beliefs, and attitudes, from the rigid moral codes of New England to the more relaxed, even bawdy ways of port cities like Charleston or New Amsterdam. Sex in this world was neither a sin to be forever hidden, nor a freedom to be flaunted. It was a fact of life, a duty sometimes, a pleasure sometimes, a cause of trouble often, and woven into it all was the ever-present tension between desire and doctrine, between human instinct and societal expectation. Let's begin with those famous Puritans, since they've left such an indelible mark on our imagination. Contrary to popular belief, the Puritans weren't against sex itself. In fact, within marriage, they saw it as a gift from God, a way to strengthen the bond between husband and wife, and of course, a means of fulfilling the biblical command to be fruitful and multiply. A good marriage, in their eyes, included a healthy, active sex life. There were even cases where husbands or wives could be brought before church authorities for neglecting their marital duties. Yes, that's right, failing to satisfy your spouse could land you in trouble, not just at home, but with the community. Yet outside marriage, things were less forgiving. Fornication, meaning sex between unmarried people, was frowned upon and often punished. Adultery was worse. In early Massachusetts, it could bring a sentence as harsh as death, though in practice punishments tended more toward fines, public shaming, or lashings. Still, the fear of exposure was real, and yet human nature being what it is, these sins were far from rare. Court records from the time are full of cases involving premarital pregnancies, affairs, and the occasional scandalous liaison. The world may have been draped in black wool and white linen, but beneath it beat very human hearts. One of the most common indicators of premarital sex was, of course, the arrival of a child sooner than expected. In an age without reliable birth control, conception was often proof of intimacy. And so a quick wedding, followed by a suspiciously early birth, was not unusual. Communities took note. Neighbors whispered. But as long as a couple married before the baby came, the matter might be overlooked. Colonial pragmatism often outweighed moral rigidity. After all, in a harsh land, surviving winter or raising crops could seem more urgent than passing judgment on timelines that said the colonies weren't a single moral landscape. Take the Chesapeake region, Virginia and Maryland. Their life was different. The population was more male-heavy, especially in the early years as tobacco planters and indentured servants flooded the land. The gender imbalance meant that women, whether free or bound, often had more choices than one might expect. Marriage was still the ideal, but many women found themselves courted with a persistence born of scarcity. And in this context, relationships, both formal and informal, sometimes took on a looser quality. Indentured servants, those men and women who had sold years of their labor to pay for passage across the ocean, faced particular challenges. Forbidden by contract to marry during their service, they nonetheless fell in love, or at least into bed, with predictable regularity. When pregnancies resulted, the consequences were severe. Women might be whipped, their contracts extended by years, and their children bound out as servants themselves. And yet these relationships continued, because no law, no sermon, no lash of the whip could entirely suppress the pull of human connection. In cities like Boston, Philadelphia, and New York, with their growing populations and bustling ports, opportunities for discretion or for sign, depending on your viewpoint. Taverns, boarding houses, and dark alleyways played host to lovers' meetings and trysts, some fleeting, some lasting. Prostitution existed, of course. So did brothels, though they were often the subject of complaint by clergymen and neighbors alike. But the trade flourished as it always has, where lonely people and easy coin come together. Sexuality in colonial America was not just about sin and punishment. It was also about affection, longing, and the hope of companionship in a hard and often lonely world. Courtship rituals, though sometimes formal, were often tender. Young people might slip away from watchful eyes to steal a kiss or exchange promises. Love letters were written, often filled with earnest, awkward declarations that sound as familiar today as they did then. Consider the custom of bundling a practice that to modern ears sounds improbable. In parts of New England and Pennsylvania, especially among the Dutch and German communities, a courting couple might be allowed to sleep in the same bed, fully clothed, often with a board placed between them, so they could talk through the night without risk of impropriety. The idea was that intimacy of conversation would lead to a stronger bond and the physical barrier would preserve chastity. Of course, human nature, being inventive, bundling didn't always work as intended, and more than a few hastily arranged weddings resulted from such overnight visits. And what of marriage itself? A colonial wedding could be a grand affair or a quiet contract, depending on wealth, region, and personal inclination. But once married, a couple was expected to fulfill not only their emotional duties to each other, but their physical ones as well. The bedchamber was not just a private space. It was, in a sense, a civic one where future citizens were made and the health of the community secured. Yet for all this intimacy in colonial America was not without its dangers. The risks of childbirth were ever present. A woman might face multiple pregnancies over the course of her life, each one a perilous venture in a time of limited medical knowledge. Maternal mortality was high and the loss of infants heartbreakingly common. These realities gave a certain gravity to matters of sex and family, a weight that shaped both joy and sorrow. As for same-sex relationships, well, the records are sparse, often deliberately so. The laws were harsh, and the risks of discovery grave. But human hearts are not so easily policed, and there are hints here and there of bonds that went beyond simple friendship. Letters, poems, and the quiet arrangements of life suggest that, even in a time of strict codes and public morality, love found its way. We spoke of marriage, the central institution upon which colonial society rested like a great timber beam. But let's look more closely now at how that bond played out day to day, year to year. Marriage in the colonies was as much a partnership of labor as of affection. A husband and wife worked together to build their home, raise their children, and keep hunger and hardship at bay. The husband was the legal head of the household, the owner of property, the voice before the court. But a wife's role, though often unrecorded, was no less vital. She spun, wove, cooked, cleaned, tended the garden, raised the children, and of course, shared her husband's bed. In this shared bed, affection could thrive or struggle. The ideal was a marriage of mutual respect, of gentle companionship, of physical satisfaction that reinforced emotional ties. And indeed, many colonial couples seem to have enjoyed such bonds. Their letters, where they survive, speak of longing during separations, of joy in reunions, of a tenderness that persisted even amid hardship. A husband off on business or war might write with a simple plea, "I long to lie once more in our bed." A wife might respond with equal yearning, "May God return thee safe to me, for I ache to feel thy arms again." But not all marriages were so blessed. Some were marked by discord, by coldness, or by cruelty. A woman trapped in such a union had few legal options. Divorce was exceedingly rare and difficult to obtain, requiring proof of adultery, abandonment, impotence, or extreme cruelty, and even then approval from the legislature or the highest colonial courts. Separation might be possible, but it brought no freedom to remarry. And so many women bore their sorrows, silently seeking solace in their children, their faith, or the quiet comforts of friendship. Sex within marriage was both a right and a duty. Courts intervened when one partner neglected the other's needs. A wife could, in theory, bring a complaint against a husband who refused her his bed. A husband could do the same. But more often these matters were settled in the privacy of the home or in whispered counsel from clergy or kin. The expectation was simple. Husband and wife were to meet each other's desires for the health of the soul and the peace of the household. And what of the desires that stepped beyond the bounds of marriage? Fornication, sex between the unmarried, was a common concern of colonial courts. Pregnancies revealed what kisses in the dark or embraces behind the barn might otherwise have kept secret. And so young men and women were fined, whipped, or compelled to marry. The law sought to restore order where passion had run ahead of propriety. Hey friends, tonight we are going to know how different dating and sex were in colonial America. What were the weird and awkward things of that time which were very normal according to them? So, before you get comfortable, like the video and subscribe. And let me know in the comments where you're joining in from and what time it is there. It's always fascinating to know who's joining us today from around the world. So take a deep breath, settle yourself into a comforting space, dim the lights. Let's begin this journey together. When we think of colonial America, what often comes to mind are images of stern-faced Puritans, buttoned up tight, clutching Bibles, and casting judgment on anything remotely pleasurable. But that's only part of the story. The colonies were a patchwork of cultures, beliefs, and attitudes, from the rigid moral codes of New England to the more relaxed, even bawdy ways of port cities like Charleston or New Amsterdam. Sex in this world was neither a sin to be forever hidden nor a freedom to be flaunted. It was a fact of life, a duty sometimes, a pleasure sometimes, a cause of trouble often. And woven into it all was the ever-present tension between desire and doctrine, between human instinct and societal expectation. Let's begin with those famous Puritans, since they've left such an indelible mark on our imagination. Contrary to popular belief, the Puritans weren't against sex itself. In fact, within marriage, they saw it as a gift from God, a way to strengthen the bond between husband and wife, and of course, a means of fulfilling the biblical command to be fruitful and multiply. A good marriage in their eyes included a healthy, active sex life. There were even cases where husbands or wives could be brought before church authorities for neglecting their marital duties. Yes, that's right, failing to satisfy your spouse could land you in trouble, not just at home, but with the community. Yet outside marriage, things were less forgiving. Fornication, meaning sex between unmarried people, was frowned upon and often punished. Adultery was worse. In early Massachusetts, it could bring a sentence as harsh as death, though in practice punishments tended more toward fines, public shaming, or lashings. Still, the fear of exposure was real, and yet human nature being what it is, these sins were far from rare. Court records from the time are full of cases involving premarital pregnancies, affairs, and the occasional scandalous liaison. The world may have been draped in black wool and white linen, but beneath it beat very human hearts. One of the most common indicators of premarital sex was, of course, the arrival of a child sooner than expected. In an age without reliable birth control, conception was often proof of intimacy. And so a quick wedding followed by a suspiciously early birth was not unusual. Communities took note. Neighbors whispered. But as long as a couple married before the baby came, the matter might be overlooked. Colonial pragmatism often outweighed moral rigidity. After all, in a harsh land, surviving winter or raising crops could seem more urgent than passing judgment on timelines. That said, the colonies weren't a single moral landscape. Take the Chesapeake region, Virginia, and Maryland. Their life was different. The population was more male-heavy, especially in the early years, as tobacco planters and indentured servants flooded the land. The gender imbalance meant that women, whether free or bound, often had more choices than one might expect. Marriage was still the ideal, but many women found themselves courted with a persistence born of scarcity. And in this context, relationships, both formal and informal, sometimes took on a looser quality. Indentured servants, those men and women who had sold years of their labor to pay for passage across the ocean, faced particular challenges. Forbidden by contract to marry during their service, they nonetheless fell in love, or at least into bed, with predictable regularity. When pregnancies resulted, the consequences were severe. Women might be whipped, their contracts extended by years, and their children bound out as servants themselves. And yet these relationships continued, because no law, no sermon, no lash of the whip could entirely suppress the pull of human connection. In cities like Boston, Philadelphia, and New York, with their growing populations and bustling ports, opportunities for discretion or for sign, depending on your view about taverns, boarding houses, and dark alleyways played host to lovers' meetings and trysts, some fleeting, some lasting. Prostitution existed, of course. So did brothels, though they were often the subject of complaint by clergymen and neighbors alike. But the trade flourished, as it always has, where lonely people and easy coin come together. Sexuality in colonial America was not just about sin and punishment. It was also about affection, longing, and the hope of companionship in a hard and often lonely world. Courtship rituals, though sometimes formal, were often tender. Young people might slip away from watchful eyes to steal a kiss or exchange promises. Love letters were written, often filled with earnest, awkward declarations that sound as familiar today as they did then. Consider the custom of bundling, practice that to modern ears sounds improbable. In parts of New England and Pennsylvania, especially among the Dutch and German communities, a courting couple might be allowed to sleep in the same bed, fully clothed, often with a board placed between them, so they could talk through the night without risk of impropriety. The idea was that intimacy of conversation would lead to a stronger bond, and the physical barrier would preserve chastity. Of course, human nature being inventive, bundling didn't always work as intended, and more than a few hastily arranged weddings resulted from such overnight visits. And what of marriage itself? A colonial wedding could be a grand affair or a quiet contract, depending on wealth, region, and personal inclination. But once married, a couple was expected to fulfill not only their emotional duties to each other, but their physical ones as well. The bedchamber was not just a private space. It was, in a sense, a civic one where future citizens were made and the health of the community secured. Yet, for all this intimacy in colonial America was not without its dangers. The risks of childbirth were ever present. A woman might face multiple pregnancies over the course of her life, each one a perilous venture in a time of limited medical knowledge. Maternal mortality was high, and the loss of infants heartbreakingly common. These realities gave a certain gravity to matters of sex and family, a weight that shaped both joy and sorrow. As for same-sex relationships, well, the records are sparse, often deliberately so. The laws were harsh, and the risks of discovery grave. But human hearts are not so easily policed, and there are hints here and there of bonds that went beyond simple friendship. Letters, poems, and the quiet arrangements of life suggest that even in a time of strict codes and public morality, love found its way. We spoke of marriage, that central institution upon which colonial society rested like a great timber beam. But let's look more closely now at how that bond played out day to day, year to year. Marriage in the colonies was as much a partnership of labor as of affection. A husband and wife worked together to build their home, raise their children, and keep hunger and hardship at bay. The husband was the legal head of the household, the owner of property, the voice before the court. But a wife's role, though often unrecorded, was no less vital. She spun, wove, cooked, cleaned, tended the garden, raised the children, and of course, shared her husband's bed. In this shared bed, affection could thrive or struggle. The ideal was a marriage of mutual respect, of gentle companionship, of physical satisfaction that reinforced emotional ties. And indeed, many colonial couples seem to have enjoyed such bonds. Their letters, where they survive, speak of longing during separations, of joy in reunions, of a tenderness that persisted even amid hardship. A husband off on business or war might write with a simple plea, "I long to lie once more in our bed." A wife might respond with equal yearning, "May God return thee safe to me, for I ache to feel thy arms again." But not all marriages were so blessed. Some were marked by discord, by coldness, or by cruelty. A woman trapped in such a union had few legal options. Divorce was exceedingly rare and difficult to obtain, requiring proof of adultery, abandonment, impotence, or extreme cruelty, and even then approval from the legislature or the highest colonial courts. Separation might be possible, but it brought no freedom to remarry. And so many women bore their sorrows, silently seeking solace in their children, their faith, or the quiet comforts of friendship. Sex within marriage was both a right and a duty. Courts intervened when one partner neglected the other's needs. A wife could, in theory, bring a complaint against a husband who refused her his bed. A husband could do the same. But more often these matters were settled in the privacy of the home or in whispered counsel from clergy or kin. The expectation was simple: husband and wife were to meet each other's desires for the health of the soul and the peace of the household. And what of the desires that stepped beyond the bounds of marriage? Fornication, sex between the unmarried, was a common concern of colonial courts. Pregnancies revealed what kisses in the dark or embraces behind the barn might otherwise have kept secret. And so young men and women were fined, whipped, or compelled to marry. The law sought to restore order where passion had run ahead of propriety. But the truth, as always, was more complex than the laws could contain. Court records reveal that despite the threats of punishment, young people did what young people have always done. They met at quilting bees, at harvest dances, at church gatherings. They walked home together along moonlit lanes. They stole time when and where they could from under the watchful eyes of their elders. And sometimes these meetings led to trouble, but often they led to marriages, some hasty, some long-planned, that built the fabric of colonial society. Adultery to occupy the attention of the courts. The laws were harsh. In early Massachusetts, as we've noted, adultery could bring the death penalty, though this was seldom carried out. More commonly, the guilty parties were fined, publicly whipped, or forced to stand in the pillory, enduring the jeers of their neighbors and the shame of exposure. Women in particular bore the heavier burden, for adultery raised questions of paternity, inheritance, and household honor. A man's indiscretions might be whispered about. A woman's could ruin her entirely. Yet despite the fear of punishment, human hearts strayed. In a small community, a wandering glance, a too long touch, at a barn raising a secret meeting in a meadow. These could ignite passions that defied the strictures of the law. And once ignited, such fires were not easily quenched. Let's turn now to the question of race, for the intimate lives of colonial Americans were shaped not only by gender and class, but by the brutal realities of slavery and servitude. In the southern colonies, where enslaved Africans and African Americans formed a growing part of the population, the sexual exploitation of enslaved women was a tragic and pervasive fact. White masters, overseers, and other men in positions of power took advantage of their control, and the law offered no protection to the women they abused. The children of these unions, often unacknowledged by their fathers, inherited the status of the mother. Born into bondage, the intimate relationships among enslaved people themselves were both tender and tragic. Slaves formed families, married, in ceremonies of their own devising, or under the gaze of masters who might or might not honor their bonds. Love bloomed where it could, in stolen moments in cabins shared after long days of labor. But always there was the risk of separation. A husband sold away a wife or child torn from their arms. And so the love shared in these circumstances was often fiercely protective, a defiance of the system that sought to deny its existence. In the northern colonies, where slavery existed, but in smaller numbers, indentured servitude brought its own complex intimacies. As we've noted, servants were forbidden to marry during their term of service, yet relationships formed sometimes with fellow servants, sometimes with members of the master's household. When discovered, these could bring severe consequences. For the woman, often an extension of her servitude. For the man, a fine or lashes. But again, human nature cared little for contracts and codes when the heart was involved. And what of birth control, you might wonder? What means did colonial women have to manage the consequences of their desires? The answer, sadly, is little. Herbal remedies were known, infusions of pennyroyal tansy or rused to prevent conception or bring on menstruation. Sponges or wool soaked in vinegar might be used as a barrier, but these methods were unreliable at best. And so pregnancies followed intimacy as surely as day follows night, and large families were the norm. Childbirth, as we touched on before, was a trial both sacred and dangerous. A woman might bear a dozen or more children in her lifetime, each birth a moment of both hope and dread. Midwives, wise women of the community, attended the laboring mother, offering comfort, guidance, and what aid they could, but with no anesthesia, no antiseptics, no true medical intervention. Beyond herbs and prayers, every birth was a gamble. And yet, amid all these risks, the act of bringing new life into the world was seen as a woman's highest calling. The pain of childbirth was framed as Eve's curse, but also as a path to sanctity. A woman who bore her sufferings with grace was praised. A woman who failed to do so might be whispered about. And if she died in childbed, as too many did, she was mourned as a martyr to duty. Same-sex relationships in colonial America, as we noted, are largely invisible in the official records, erased perhaps by the fear of harsh penalties. The laws condemned sodomy, as they called it, with death in some places, though actual executions were rare. But human longing does not always align with the statutes of the land. There are glimpses, now and then, a diary entry, a letter, a poem, that suggests bonds deeper than friendship loves, that dared not speak their name. And surely, in the quiet of the night, in the shelter of forests or the hidden corners of cities, such relationships existed, as they always have. So far we've seen how marriage and desire shaped daily life in the colonies, how duty and passion shared uneasy quarters. Tonight we'll drift further, exploring the customs of courtship, the expectations of the wedding night, and the curious blend of romance and practicality that bound lovers together. Courtship in the colonies was both personal and communal. A young man seeking a wife did not simply choose a sweetheart and sweep her off her feet. His intentions were matters of public interest, watched closely by family, neighbors, and the wider community. For in a small town or village, a marriage was not just a private bond. It was a joining of fortunes, a strengthening of ties between households, a decision that could ripple through fields, shops, and church pews. Parents often played a guiding hand. A father might hint at which daughters of the town were best suited, not just pretty, but industrious, pious, of good family. A mother might quietly encourage a son to consider the virtues of a neighbor's girl, skilled at the loom, steady in her duties, kind in her manner. Love, if it came, was welcome, but stability was the prize most sought. And yet, despite these practical concerns, young people found ways to forge true affection. Bundling, as we've mentioned, offered a strange sort of intimacy. A couple permitted to share a bed, fully clothed, often separated by a board or barrier, might talk through the night, whispering hopes, dreams, and the small secrets that knit two hearts together. In the flicker of a tallow candle or the hush of a winter night, such conversations could mean far more than stolen kisses. Other customs shaped the dance of courtship. In some regions, it was common for a young man to visit his sweetheart in the evening, to sit up with her in the family parlor, under the watchful eye of her kin. The hours passed in quiet talk, with hands perhaps brushing as they shared a Bible verse or a mug of cider. There was a sweetness to this ritual, a patience, a sense that love was something grown slowly, like corn from the earth, needing time, tending, and care. When a match was made, the marriage followed, sometimes swiftly, sometimes after months or years of planning. A wedding in colonial America was rarely the grand spectacle we imagine today. There were no white gowns or elaborate cakes, no bouquets tossed to waiting hands. Instead, there was often a simple gathering, a minister, a few witnesses, a solemn exchange of vows. The couple might wear their best clothes, but not new ones. After all, cloth was dear, and a household's fortune better spent on land tools or livestock than on fine linen or lace. What mattered was the union itself, the promise made, the new household formed. After the ceremony, a modest feast might follow. Neighbors brought what they could: pies, stews, fresh bread. There might be singing, dancing, if space allowed, laughter that echoed through the night. And then at last the couple withdrew to their new bed, to begin the shared life that all had come to witness. The wedding night, a moment both dreaded and anticipated, filled with hope, curiosity, and no small measure of anxiety. For many, it was the first time they would truly be alone together, the first time they would explore the physical side of the bond they had pledged. Advice, well-meaning and otherwise, would have come from mothers, aunts, or married friends. And yet, in that quiet room, lit perhaps by a single candle, it was up to the couple to find their way, to turn awkwardness into closeness, uncertainty into trust. On some communities, the wedding bed was not entirely private. There were traditions borrowed from old European customs, in which friends or family might accompany the couple to their chamber, offering blessings, bawdy jokes, or even, in rare cases, staying nearby as witnesses to the consummation of the marriage. Such practices, though fading in colonial times, remind us how deeply intimacy was entangled with the concerns of the wider world. Once married, a couple was expected to fulfill their duties to each other, to their families, to the community. The bed was not just a place of pleasure, but of production. Children were the hoped-for fruit of union, the proof of a household's health, the future of the colony itself. A barren marriage was a source of sorrow, sometimes of suspicion, and so, with each passing month, a wife might watch her body for signs, her neighbors watching too, with sympathy or with judgment. Pregnancy brought its own mix of joy and fear. The growth of new life was seen as a blessing, a fulfillment of womanly purpose. But every woman knew the risks of long, hard labor, of fevers that followed, of babies born too soon or too still. The midwife's hands, skilled and steady, were often all that stood between a mother and death. And so the marriage bed, for all its pleasures, was never free from shadow. Let's pause a moment and consider how the wider world shaped these private matters. The laws of the colonies, influenced by English common law and local custom, reached deeply into the bedroom. Adultery, as we've seen, was a crime not merely against a spouse, but against the community's moral order. Fornication, too, was punished. Even lewd speech or behavior could bring fines or public penance. But there were limits to what the law could truly control. In port cities and along the frontiers, where the gaze of the church was weaker, human appetites found freer expression. Taverns offered drink and company, sometimes more. Brothels, officially condemned but unofficially tolerated, served sailors, soldiers, and others far from home. And in the wilderness, where settlers carved out lives far from town centers, the rules of propriety sometimes bent beneath the weight of isolation and need. It is worth noting that amid all this, there were voices urging compassion, moderation, and understanding. Ministers preached the sanctity of marriage, yes, but also its joys, urging couples to find in each other not just duty but delight. Writers of advice manuals spoke of tenderness, of the importance of kindness in the marriage bed, of the need for husbands to cherish their wives and wives their husbands. Even in a world so concerned with order and control, the simple truth endured, that love was most enduring when built on gentleness and care. And what of those who did not marry? The spinsters, the bachelors, the widows and widowers. Their lives, too, were shaped by the customs and expectations of the time. A woman who remained unmarried past the usual age might be pitied, suspected, or simply ignored. Yet, many such women carved out places of usefulness as midwives, teachers, caretakers of kin. Men who did not marry might face fewer questions, but even they were expected eventually to settle down to contribute to the stability of society through the founding of a household. Widowhood was a common state given the hardships of life. A widow might remarry swiftly, especially if young, for protection and support. Or she might choose independence, managing her late husband's estate, raising her children, alone navigating the world with a blend of caution and strength. Widowers too often remarried, seeking companionship, help in the home, and yes, a partner to share the marriage bed once more. Courtship, marriage, and the shared duties of the household formed the visible framework of intimacy in colonial America. But behind that framework lay quieter truths, the hopes, fears, and unspoken knowledge that governed fertility, contraception, and the mysteries of the body. Colonial women lived with a deep awareness of their cycles and signs. Without modern science, they relied on folk wisdom passed from mothers to daughters, midwives to young wives, neighbors to friends. The rhythms of the moon, the phases of planting and harvest, the flow of rivers, all were seen as connected to the ebb and flow of fertility. A woman's body, like the land itself, was part of creation's great cycle, expected to bear fruit in its season. And yet, for all the celebration of large families, there were times when couples sought to limit births. The reasons varied: a struggling farm, a fragile mother's health, the simple weariness of too many mouths to feed. The methods, though few, were known. Women used herbs, pennyroyal, tansy, and rue, among them brewed into bitter teas or steeped into strong infusions. These might be taken to bring on a late period or to prevent conception, though success was far from guaranteed. Other methods involved physical barriers: cloth soaked in vinegar or wine sponges, or wool inserted before intercourse, said to block or weaken the seed. There were charms and amulets, to bits of folk magic mingled with prayer whispered over a woman's belly or tied about the bedpost. And always there was caution. Such measures, if discovered, might bring not only gossip but accusations of sin, or worse, of witchcraft. Pregnancy once begun was a time of both hope and dread. A woman might feel joy at the quickening when the first flutter of movement reassured her that life stirred within, but she might also feel the heavy weight of worry. For herself, for the child, for the family she already labored to sustain. The months ahead were a journey of faith, endurance, and often pain. Midwives were central figures in this journey, chosen for their skill, their steadiness, their knowledge of herbs and prayers alike. They guided women through labor's long hours. Their hands caught the child, cleaned and swaddled it, and offered it to its mother with words of comfort or sorrow, depending on what the night had brought. Childbirth was often attended by other women, sisters, mothers, neighbors. Men waited outside, listening for the baby's first cry, the midwife's quiet reassurance, or in darker moments, the tolling of a bell or the weeping of kin. The line between life and death was thin, and each birth was a crossing of that line uncertain, until the end. Infant mortality was heartbreakingly common. Fevers, infections, accidents, all could snatch away a newborn before it had drawn many breaths. And so baptism was performed quickly, often within hours or days, to safeguard the soul. If a baby sickened before the minister could arrive, the midwife might be called upon to baptize, using water and whispered words, offering what protection she could. For those who longed for children, but found their hopes unfulfilled, the sorrow ran deep. Infertility, though little understood, was often blamed on the woman. Remedies were many: tonics of herbs, fumigations of smoke and spice, amulets pressed to the skin, prayers offered at bedside. A woman might be urged to seek a change of air, to visit a healing spring, to submit to the laying on of hands by some reputed wise person. But often these efforts brought little but disappointment. Men's role in fertility was rarely questioned. If children did not come, it was assumed the wife's body bore the fault. And so she carried not only her own grief, but the judgment of others, spoken or unspoken. A barren woman's position was fragile. Without sons or daughters, she lacked the security children provided. For old age, for inheritance, for standing in the community. As children grew, their care and guidance became the shared task of the household. From infancy, they were swaddled, tight carried at the mother's side, as she worked or rocked in simple cradles by the hearth. As soon as they could walk, they were given small tasks: to fetch water, to tend chickens, to gather kindling. Childhood was brief, a preparation for labor and duty. Boys were taught the skills of farming trade. or craft by their fathers, uncles, or masters. Girls learned the arts of spinning, sewing, cooking, and keeping house, watching their mothers and aunts, practicing on scraps of cloth or small pots on the hearth's edge. And woven through all this was instruction in faith. Prayers learned at a parent's knee, scripture read aloud at table, sermons absorbed from the pulpit. The passage from child to adult came early. A girl might marry in her mid-teens, a boy not much older. The body's readiness for intimacy and childbirth was assumed to be matched by the soul's readiness for duty, though the truth was often more complicated. A young bride might know little of what awaited her in marriage's bed or in its burdens. A young husband might find himself unprepared for the weight of responsibility suddenly placed upon his shoulders. Same-sex relationships remained hidden where they existed, their traces faint in the records. The law condemned them harshly. The culture spoke of them rarely, except in tones of warning or disgust. And yet, in a world where emotional bonds were often forged within gendered spaces, men working together in fields or shops, women laboring side by side at hearth and loom, affections surely blossomed, sometimes crossing the line from friendship into deeper attachment. Such love had to remain secret, shielded by caution, invisible to the gaze of neighbors and law alike. Among enslaved people, as well, intimacy bore the heavy burden of power. The marriages of slaves had no legal standing, though couples formed bonds of love and loyalty as strong as any free union. They wed in ceremonies of their own making, jumping the broom, exchanging vows in whispered words, joining hands beneath the stars. But at any moment, a master's will could tear them apart. A husband sold away, a wife taken for another's use, a child lost to a trader's wagon. All these were threats that shadowed the tenderest moments. And yet, in defiance of that cruelty, enslaved people loved, married, bore children, and fought to protect their families as best they could. Their intimacy was an act of resistance, a claim to humanity, denied by the system that bound them. The wider world of the colonies shaped intimacy. In other ways too. Disease was a constant presence, smallpox, measles, fevers of all kinds. A sickness might sweep through a town or a plantation, leaving loss in its wake, touching the old, the young, the strong, and the frail alike. Such trials drew couples together, or sometimes drove them apart as fear and grief tested their bonds. And then there were the rituals of mourning. When a spouse died, the survivor was expected to grieve, sometimes in prescribed ways. Black clothing, withdrawal from social gatherings, solemn demeanor. But remarriage was common, especially for widowers, and often swift. Life's hardships left little room for long solitude. A house needed tending, children needed care, and the comforts of companionship called dot throughout all these patterns of love and loss of desire and duty, of joy and sorrow, ran a simple truth, that the people of colonial America, for all their differences from us, longed for connection. They sought it in marriage, in friendship, in family. They made mistakes, they found forgiveness. They stumbled and rose again. The rhythms of daily life in colonial America flowed steadily, shaped by the seasons, the land, and the customs passed down from generation to generation. Within this steady flow, the intimate bonds of marriage and family formed the quiet heart of each household. Yet beyond these familiar walls, broader forces stirred: religion, law, economy, all playing their part in shaping how people lived, loved, and longed. Religion stood as both guide and guardian over intimate life, from the Puritan meeting houses of New England to the Anglican churches of Virginia. Ministers preached not only of salvation and sin, but of the duties between husband and wife. A good marriage was seen as a reflection of divine order. The home was called a little commonwealth, where the man ruled gently but firmly, the woman obeyed and honored, and both labored together to raise godly children. Sermons spoke of the importance of tenderness within marriage, of fidelity, of the care a husband owed his wife, and the respect a wife owed her husband. But they also warned against temptation, the wandering eye, the secret desire, the sin that might begin with a glance and end in disgrace. Colonial laws echoed these teachings. Adultery was not only a betrayal of a spouse, it was a crime against the moral fabric of the community. Yet human weakness often proved stronger than fear of punishment. Records from courtrooms and church hearings reveal story after story of a man caught visiting a woman not his wife, of a woman found to be pregnant by someone other than her husband, of whispered scandals that erupted into public shame. Sometimes there was forgiveness. Sometimes there was penance, standing before the congregation to confess, paying a fine or suffering a lashing at the town whipping post. And sometimes lives were broken, reputations lost, families divided. Even so, in the quiet of the home, many couples found comfort in each other. Love letters where they survive speak of true affection. A husband writing of his longing during long separations, a wife expressing her joy at his safe return. These were not always arranged or loveless unions. Many grew into partnerships of deep friendship, strengthened by shared work and shared sorrow. Intimacy within marriage was seen as both a pleasure and a duty. Colonial guides for husbands and wives encouraged kindness, patience, and the meeting of each other's needs. And while much of the language of the time was formal, even severe, beneath it lay an understanding that a marriage without warmth could not long endure. Outside of marriage, intimacy took different forms, some secret, some tolerated, some condemned. Prostitution existed in every sizable town and city, despite laws against it. Brothels operated quietly sometimes, with the unspoken permission of authorities who preferred vice to remain discreet rather than public and disruptive. Sailors, soldiers, and laborers far from home sought company where they could find it. The women who provided such company lived precarious lives, facing not only the risk of disease and violence, but also the ever-present threat of arrest or worse. On the frontiers where settlements were scattered and law less firmly applied, relationships sometimes followed looser patterns. A couple might live together as husband and wife without formal ceremony, especially if no minister or magistrate was nearby to make it official. In these remote places, survival often mattered more than formality, and neighbors were less likely to judge what was seen as practical necessity. Among enslaved people, the patterns of intimacy were shaped and often shattered by the cruel realities of bondage. Slaves married in their own way, creating bonds of love and loyalty that masters neither recognized nor respected. A broom might be jumped, vows exchanged under cover of night. But these unions had no legal standing, and at any time, husband and wife might be sold apart, their children torn from their arms. And yet, despite these hardships, enslaved men and women formed families, raised children, and fought to preserve their dignity and humanity. The customs of courtship and marriage too reflected the diversity of the colonies. In Pennsylvania, with its mix of English Quakers, German Mennonites, and others, marriage could take many forms. Quakers married in simple ceremonies, without clergy speaking vows before their meeting and signing their names in a record book. German settlers often followed Old World customs with matchmaking by family elders and weddings that combined solemnity with hearty feasting. Weddings might include symbolic gestures, the giving of a coin to represent shared wealth, the sharing of bread and salt to to signify hospitality and provision. There was often music, dancing, and communal joy. Yet beneath the celebration lay a deep seriousness, the knowledge that marriage was for life, a joining not only of two people, but of two families, two sets of responsibilities. The idea of consent in marriage was understood differently than it is today. A wife's body was seen as belonging to her husband as his to hers, according to the teachings of Scripture and the customs of the time. Sexual refusal within marriage was rare and could be cause for complaint before church or court. But even here there were voices urging gentleness, clergy reminding husbands to treat their wives with kindness, to value their well-being, to seek harmony rather than domination. Fertility was both a blessing and a burden. Large families were the norm, not only because children were seen as gifts from God, but because they were needed to help on the farm, in the shop, at the loom. Every child brought joy and also worry, for their health, their future, their survival. And every birth carried risk. A mother's life was often shortened by the toll of repeated pregnancies, by complications of childbirth, by the dangers of fever or infection. Contraception was rarely spoken of openly, but the knowledge existed. Women shared secrets, herbs to delay conception, methods to space children, practices whispered about but rarely written down. Such knowledge was passed quietly from one generation to the next, often mingled with superstition, prayer, and the hope that God might understand the weariness that sometimes lay beneath the desire for another child. Widowhood came early and often. Life was hard, and death a frequent visitor. A woman left without a husband might remarry quickly for security and companionship. A man left without a wife often did the same, seeking help in the home, a mother for his children, and warmth beside him at night. Second marriages were common, and blended families, a familiar part of colonial life. And through all these patterns of union and separation, of birth and loss, run the simple, enduring need for connection. The people of colonial America, for all their stern laws and rigid customs, were moved by the same hopes and fears that move us still. They longed for love, for comfort, for the shelter of another's arms. They sought to build lives of meaning, to raise children, to leave behind something that would endure. Their intimate lives were shaped by the world around them, by the church's teachings, the law's demands, the land's harshness, and the community's watchful gaze. And yet, within these bounds, they found room for tenderness, for desire, for the small, quiet joys that made their struggles bearable. Part 6. The colonies pressed onward, year by year, as fields were cleared, homes raised, and families grew. In this steady work of building a life from the wilderness, intimacy remained a quiet, constant, woven through the rhythms of toil, worship, and rest. Yet no part of life, not even the most private, was untouched by the broader currents of change that flowed through the colonies. The growth of towns and cities began to reshape the landscape of relationships. Where once isolated farmsteads meant few neighbors and fewer choices, now bustling markets, crowded wharves, and narrow streets offered new opportunities, new temptations. In places like Boston, New York, Charleston, and Philadelphia, young people met beyond the watchful eyes of their parents. At taverns, at fairs, at public lectures or dances. Taverns in particular were places where the boundaries between propriety and indulgence often blurred. There, over mugs of ale or cider, men and women talked freely, laughed loudly, and sometimes arranged meetings that had little to do with courtship's formal steps. Music, drink, and the ease of a crowd could loosen tongues and intentions alike. And while colonial authorities frowned upon such mixing and ministers thundered warnings from the pulpit, the pull of companionship in a lonely world was not resisted the growth of the merchant class, added another layer to the complexities of intimate life. Wealth brought choices, better prospects in marriage, more elaborate courtships, and at times greater discretion for those who strayed. A wealthy husband might afford to keep a mistress, his indiscretions smoothed over by status or silenced by settlements. A well-born woman might risk an affair if she believed herself safe behind the curtains of wealth and influence. But always there was risk. Gossip moved swiftly in tight-knit communities, and even the most careful secret could unravel under the weight of rumor. For those who served this emerging classmates, apprentices, indentured servants, the dynamics of intimacy were more fraught. A master's household was both a workplace and a site of constant supervision, and yet human nature did not pause for duty. Servants fell in love sometimes with each other, sometimes with members of the family they served. These liaisons, when discovered, often ended badly. Dismissals, fines, or the extension of a servant's term as punishment for impropriety. In the world of enslaved people, intimacy continued to be shaped and shattered by the will of others. On large plantations, where enslaved men and women were forced together from many cultures and languages, families were formed with courage and care, despite the knowledge that any day might bring separation. Slaveholders sometimes encouraged unions among the enslaved, seeing in these bonds a way to discourage escape or rebellion. But these same masters could, and often did, tear apart the families they had permitted to form. Love among enslaved people was an act of hope in the face of relentless cruelty. Among free people of color, especially in cities like New Orleans and Charleston, a different pattern emerged. There's some free black families carved out lives of relative stability, marrying within their communities, raising children, building businesses or trades. Others entered into arrangements that reflected the complicated hierarchies of race, status, and power relationships between free women of color and white men that offered protection or advantage, but at the cost of true equality or security. Throughout the colonies, the connection between sex and property remained tight. Marriage contracts, when drawn up, spelled out dowries, land rights, and inheritance. A woman's virtue, as the phrase went, was tied to her value in these transactions. A bride who entered marriage pregnant or with rumors swirling about her reputation might see her prospects diminished, her dowry reduced her. Standing in her new household undermined from the start. Yet even in these material concerns, affection often found a way. Many couples once joined worked to build not only wealth or position, but true companionship. Letters between husbands and wives revealed tenderness, concern, longing. A merchant writing from a distant port might end his business report with a line about missing his wife's smile. A farmer might write from town of his eagerness to return to his home and hearth. Within the home, the bedchamber was not always the private refuge we might imagine. Children often slept nearby in trundle beds or cradles at the foot of the parents' bed. Extended family, apprentices, or servants might share the house, their presence felt even through closed doors. Privacy in such crowded spaces was rare, and moments of intimacy had to be stolen where they could. Pregnancy remained a frequent part of married life. The gap between children might be short, a year, perhaps two, before the next infant arrived. A woman might spend much of her married life either expecting or nursing a child, her body shaped and reshaped by the demands of motherhood. And always beneath the joy of new life, there lurked the dangers of childbirth. A labor that began in hope could end in tragedy. A woman's friends and family gathered to help, to pray, to comfort, but there were limits to what comfort could do. When complications arose, in larger towns, Midwives sometimes faced competition from male physicians, though few doctors had real knowledge of childbirth beyond what they had read in books. The arrival of a physician at a birth was often a sign of trouble called in when the midwife's skills had been exhausted. And even then the tools of the doctor were crude, the outcomes uncertain. As the colonies grew, so too did the influence of ideas from Europe. The Enlightenment began to reach across the ocean, bringing with it new ways of thinking about the self, about marriage, about the rights and duties of individuals. Pamphlets and books circulated among the literate, questioning old assumptions, proposing new ideals of partnership, of education, of reason, guiding passion, rather than the other way around. But change came slowly. For most colonists, life continued, much as it had. Work, worship, marriage, children, and the quiet private moments that gave meaning to the daily grind. And while the forms of intimacy were shaped by law, by religion, by custom, the feelings themselves, the longing for connection, the comfort of touch, the sorrow of loss remained as timeless as the tides, even as new ideas whispered of freedom and equality. The colonies remained places where the intimate lives of men and women were deeply bound by duty, by expectation, and by the ever-present need to endure. Families grew, struggled, rejoiced, and mourned, their stories written in the shared work of making a new world from the wilderness. There in the quiet of the night, a husband's hand found his wife's, a mother soothed a fretful child. A young couple newly wed spoke in hushed tones of the life they hoped to build together. And so in these small, fleeting moments, the grand story of a nation was written, not in declarations or battles, but in the private, enduring bonds of the heart. Part 7. The colonies were entering a time of growing tension, as old ways of thinking began to rub against new ideas, and the private world of intimacy reflected these larger shifts. Relationships within marriage, between classes, and across racial lines, were shaped not only by custom and law, but increasingly by questions of rights, duties, and personal agency. In households, both grand and humble, marriage remained the expected framework for intimacy. Yet cracks sometimes showed beneath the surface of this ideal. The expectations placed upon wives were enormous: to manage the household, bear and raise children, support their husbands, and maintain a reputation for modesty and virtue. Husbands, too, felt the pressures of providing, protecting, and upholding the family's honor. And when these pressures grew to great tensions, could spill over into quarrels, silences, or, in the worst cases, violence. Public records reveal instances where wives petitioned courts for relief from cruel husbands, or where neighbors intervened in domestic disputes. While the law generally favored husbands, communities did not always turn a blind eye to abuse. Ministers and elders might counsel troubled couples, urging reconciliation, temperance, and forgiveness. But the power dynamics within marriage left women vulnerable, and avenues for true escape from a dangerous union were few. At the same time, the idea of companionate marriage, one based not just on duty or property, but on mutual affection and shared values, began to take firmer root. Among the literate classes, particularly those influenced by Enlightenment ideas, pamphlets and sermons urged husbands to see their wives as partners rather than subjects. Wives were encouraged to be not merely obedient, but wise counselors trusted in matters of household and child-rearing alike. Education, though limited for most colonial women, was increasingly seen as desirable for daughters as well as sons, at least in families with means. A wife able to read scripture, manage household accounts, and instruct her children in moral and practical matters was valued. And with education came a broader sense of self, a subtle reshaping of what it meant to be a wife, a mother, a woman. In The world of servants, apprentices, and the laboring poor, the patterns of intimacy often bore the marks of hardship. Young women in service were vulnerable to the advances of masters, overseers, and older apprentices. When relationships resulted in pregnancy, the woman bore the heaviest penalties, fines, loss of position, or the extension of her service by months or years. Yet for many, affection bloomed despite the risks. Couples formed attachments in kitchens, fields, and workshops, their bonds strengthened by shared toil and the hope of building a life beyond servitude. For enslaved men and women, intimacy remained an act of resilience. Marriage ceremonies, though unrecognized by law, were deeply meaningful within the community. A broom might be jumped or hands joined beneath an ancient tree, witnessed by friends and family. These unions were honored and supported by those who shared the same struggles. But the threat of separation loomed constantly, as a master's decision could at any moment sunder what love had joined. The children of these unions grew up in a world that denied their humanity, yet within the home they were cherished, protected as best as circumstances allowed. Parents taught what they could: the importance of faith, the strength of endurance, the value of solidarity. Older children cared for younger siblings, while their parents worked from dawn to dusk. And amid the harshness of bondage, moments of joy were seized where they could be found: at harvest festivals, at clandestine gatherings, in stolen hours of rest. In urban centers, the growth of newspapers and printed pamphlets brought wider awareness of moral debates, scandals, and shifting attitudes about intimate life. Gossip columns and moral essays described and often exaggerated the failings of individuals. A prominent merchant's affair, a minister's indiscretion, a young woman's fall from virtue. These stories served both as warnings and as sources of titillation, fueling conversations in parlors and taverns alike. The print culture also carried imported ideas about love and marriage from Europe. Novels and essays spoke of romance, of choice, of marriages founded on love rather than mere arrangement. Young people, especially in towns, began to imagine futures shaped not solely by duty but by personal happiness. This did not mean the end of arranged or practical marriages, but it added a new thread to the tapestry of expectations. Among same-sex relationships, the silence remained deep. The harsh penalties on the books, combined with social and religious condemnation, kept such relationships hidden. Yet hints survive: letters that speak in tender tones lifelong. Friendships that may have carried deeper meaning, the careful arrangements of households shared by two men or two women beyond what was strictly necessary for economic survival. The danger of exposure was real, but so too was the need for connection. Medicine and folk wisdom continued to influence how colonists thought about sex and the body. Midwives, herbalists, and increasingly physicians offered remedies for fertility troubles, for the pain of childbirth, for ailments thought to stem from imbalances of the body's humors. Women relied on one another, sharing recipes for teas and poultices, offering advice drawn from experience. Men too sought cures for perceived weaknesses, often turning to tonics or prayers, or, in wealthier circles, to the growing number of medical practitioners in the colonies. Disease and mortality shaped intimate life in ways large and small. Epidemics of smallpox, yellow fever, or influenza could sweep through a town, leaving widows and orphans, breaking families, altering plans for marriage or courtship. The unpredictability of life lent urgency to relationships. Proposals could come swiftly, marriages arranged in haste, families joined in the hope of seizing happiness before it was snatched away. The customs of mourning shaped how intimacy was remembered. Widows wore black often for a year or more, signaling their loss to the community, Widowers might observe a briefer period of mourning before seeking a new wife, especially if children needed care. Gravestones sometimes bore tender inscriptions testifying to the affection between husband and wife, or the heartbreak of losing a beloved child. These markers carved in stone offered public witness to private sorrow and to the bonds that had shaped a life. In the countryside and on the frontier, where settlements were thin and ministers scarce, marriage sometimes followed the rhythms of necessity rather than formal ceremony. A couple might exchange vows before friends, agreeing to be husband and wife in all but law until a preacher could be found. Such unions were generally accepted by neighbors, provided the couple behaved as married folks should: faithful, industrious, raising their children with care. Throughout these variations, the constant thread was the longing for connection for a partner in life's labors, for comfort against loneliness and fear. Whether in the grand houses of merchants, the cabins of farmers, the quarters of slaves, or the crowded rooms of the city, poor people sought out love, companionship, and solace in each other's arms. Part 8. The colonies by this time were places of both deep tradition and slow transformation. Intimate life, shaped for generations by inherited customs, was beginning to reflect these quiet changes. Still, at its heart, the pattern of daily existence remained familiar. The hard work of survival, the hope of prosperity, and the ever-present need for connection, for a hand to hold through the trials of an uncertain world. The laws surrounding intimacy continued to reflect a blend of moral concern and social control. Adultery, fornication, and lewd behavior were still formally punished. But increasingly, as towns grew larger and more complex, the ability to police private life weakened. In a small farming village, the comings and goings of neighbors were easy to track, and scandal traveled fast. But in the winding streets of Boston, New York, or Philadelphia, anonymity could offer cover for those whose private choices strayed from public norms. The court records of the time hint at both the persistence of moral strictness and the limits of its reach. Young couples caught meeting in the woods or lingering too long after a dance might still face public penance or a fine. A woman who bore a child out of wedlock might be brought before the court, compelled to name the father and face the shame of confession. Yet more often than before, communities found themselves turning a blind eye, focusing instead on matters of trade, security, and politics. Among those with wealth or status, discretion became its own kind of shield. A merchant or landowner whose conduct would have brought swift judgment upon a laborer might find his missteps quietly overlooked, so long as they caused no public scandal. A well-born woman's indiscretions might be smoothed over by hasty marriage, or concealed by the silence of servants. Still, the threat of exposure always lingered. Gossip fueled by envy or malice could undo even the most careful secrets. Courtship itself reflected the gradual shift from purely practical matches to unions where affection played a greater role. The old rituals endured, the exchange of tokens, the visits under parental supervision, the formal declarations of intent. But alongside these customs grew new ideals inspired by the writings of philosophers and poets, by novels that told of love, triumphant over obstacle, of marriages founded not just on property and alliance, but on mutual respect and tender feeling. Yet for most, the balance of romance and reality remained delicate. A farmer's daughter might dream of marrying for love, but she also knew that her choice must help secure the family's future. A young man full of affection for his sweetheart still had to consider the dowry she might bring or the land her father could offer. And so, even as hearts longed for companionship, heads weighed the practicalities of survival. Within marriage, the rhythms of intimate life continued as they always had. shaped by work, by the seasons, by the demands of household and field. Couples rose early, worked side by side, shared meals, and found in the quiet hours of night whatever solace or closeness they could. For many, these bonds deepened over time, strengthened by shared labor, shared loss, and the small joys that brightened even the hardest days. And still as ever, childbirth loomed large in the life of every married woman. With each pregnancy came both hope and fear. Hope for a healthy child, fear of the dangers that attended every birth. Midwives remained the trusted guides through this perilous journey, their skill and calm often the only defense against disaster. And when disaster came, as it too often did, it was they who comforted the grieving, who helped the living carry on. For those who could afford it, physicians were sometimes called to assist in difficult births or to provide remedies for fertility troubles, but medical knowledge remained limited, and folk wisdom continued to be the more trusted source of guidance for most families. Women shared recipes for teas, salves, and poultices, said to ease labor or guard against miscarriage. Men too might seek advice or tonics, though the language of the time framed concerns about fertility almost entirely in terms of the wife's body. In the cities, the mingling of people from many places and walks of life created both opportunity and danger for those seeking connection. Taverns, marketplaces, and boarding houses became places where friendships, courtships, and liaisons began. For some, this led to marriage and stability. For others, it led to heartache, scandal, or the quiet sorrow of promises broken. Among enslaved people, the intimate bonds they forged continued to serve as a bulwark against the dehumanizing weight of bondage. A whispered vow, a shared meal, the naming of a child. These small acts were affirmations of personhood in a world that sought to deny it. But always the shadow of loss darkened these moments. A master's whim, a debt to be paid, or the brutal demands of the market could tear families apart with no warning, no appeal, no recourse. Free black communities, where they existed, struggled to preserve the right to marry, to form families, and to raise their children in peace. But the laws of many colonies placed restrictions on these freedoms, limiting where people could live, whom they could marry, and how they could provide for their kin. Even so, these communities built churches, schools, and mutual aid societies that nurtured and defended their members as best they could. The silence around same-sex relationships remained deep, enforced by law and custom alike. Yet the bonds of affection between friends of the same sex were celebrated openly, so long as they stayed within the accepted bounds of friendship. Letters between women, in particular, often spoke in language of great tenderness, their words a comfort in lives that could be lonely and constrained. For some, these friendships surely grew into something more, though the traces they left behind are faint and often ambiguous, hidden by the need for caution. Ideas of virtue, honor, and reputation continued to weigh heavily on intimate life. A woman's worth was tied to her perceived purity before marriage and her fidelity after. A man's honor was bound to his ability to provide, to protect, and to control his household. When these ideals were upheld, the community praised. When they failed, the community judged. But beneath these public expectations lay the private realities of compromise, of forgiveness, of quiet endurance. The colonists, in their intimate lives, as in all things, were people of contradictions. They held fast to strict codes of morality, yet often failed to meet them. They spoke of duty and submission, yet longed for affection and joy. They punished those who strayed, yet sometimes envied them their freedom. And through it all, they sought in each other's arms the comfort that made the hardships of their world bearable. Across the colonies, the patterns of intimate life continued to mirror the push and pull between old traditions and emerging ideas. The expectations of marriage, duty, and morality still held firm, but beneath the surface change was stirring, slowly, quietly reshaping the private world of men and women, even as the colonies edged toward larger upheaval. The structure of marriage remained the cornerstone of colonial society. A union was not just a personal bond. It was a practical alliance, a means of securing property, labor, and future generations. In the language of the time, a good marriage was a well-ordered household, a partnership that contributed to the stability of the community. The husband remained the head of this little commonwealth tasked with providing, protecting, and leading in both spiritual and worldly matters. The wife was to be industrious, obedient, and supportive, her work as vital as his, though less publicly praised. Yet within these formal roles, there was room for affection, for friendship, for the small intimacies that made a life together meaningful. Couples who shared not just work, but genuine companionship often found comfort and strength in one another. Letters between husbands and wives reveal moments of tenderness, a wife reminding her absent husband to dress warmly on a journey, a husband writing of the ache he felt to be home again. Children, of course, were seen as the natural fruit of marriage, and families were often large, not by romantic ideal, but by necessity. Every child meant another pair of hands to help on the farm, in the shop, or at the loom. But every child also brought new worries, of illness, of accident, of the harsh world waiting beyond the threshold. The bond between parent and child was deep, shaped by both love and the shared struggle to survive. The bedchamber, where these new lives often began, remained both a private space and a site of community concern. A marriage without children invited whispers, a wife without sons pity. Couples who struggled with fertility might turn to prayer, to midwives' remedies, or to folk practices passed down through generations. A charm tucked beneath the pillow, a special tea brewed from herbs gathered by moonlight, a blessing spoken over the marriage bed. These were the quiet measures taken when hope and worry mingled. For those who wished to delay or prevent pregnancy, options remained few and uncertain. Knowledge of herbs believed to prevent conception or bring on menstruation circulated among women, shared in hushed tones. Midwives, wise women, and even some men kept such secrets, but always with caution. The line between folk remedy and forbidden knowledge was thin, and a woman accused of tampering too much with nature risked not just gossip, but charges of sin or even witchcraft. In towns and cities, where people lived more closely together, the complexities of intimate life grew sharper. Boarding houses and apprenticeships threw young men and women into proximity sometimes, fostering attachments, sometimes leading to scandal. A maid who found herself with child by a fellow servant, a master, or a visitor risked dismissal, shame, and hardship. The man's fate depended on his status. He might be fined, required to marry, or if he was of means, his indiscretion might be quietly managed through payment or promise. Among the wealthier classes, discretion was often the watchword. Affairs might be tolerated or overlooked so long as they did not disrupt the household or give rise to public scandal. But when secrets came to light, the fall from grace could be swift. A lady's reputation once stained was difficult to restore. A gentleman might recover more easily, but even he could find his standing diminished if his conduct too openly defied the expectations of honor and propriety. In the world of enslaved people, the bonds of love and family remained under constant threat. A husband might be sold away, a wife sent to another plantation, children scattered among owners, with no regard for the ties of blood. Yet enslaved men and women continued to form families, to marry in the eyes of their community, to raise children with care and courage. These acts were not just expressions of affection, but defiant assertions of humanity in the face of a system built to deny it. Free Black communities, small but resilient, sought to protect the right to marry and raise families without interference. Churches and mutual aid societies provided support, offering a measure of stability in a world that often sought to undermine it. These families too navigated the challenges of poverty, discrimination, and the ever-present fear that freedom itself might be stripped away by changing laws or violent neighbors. Same-sex relationships remained almost entirely hidden, their existence hinted at only in the most indirect ways. A pair of unmarried women sharing a home might be seen as sensible companionship. To men, living and working together might be respected as industrious partners. In such arrangements, affection might blossom quietly, safely shielded by the assumptions of those around them. But the law and the church left no room for open acknowledgement of such bonds, and so whatever deeper ties existed, they left behind few traces. Throughout all these variations, death remained an ever-present force shaping intimate life. Disease, accident, and childbirth claimed lives without warning. Widowhood was common, and remarriage often swift, especially where young children were left in need of care. A widower might marry again within months. A widow, especially one of childbearing age, might do the same, balancing grief with the need for security and support. Mourning customs reflected both personal loss and public expectation. A widow's black garments signaled her grief to the world, while the absence of such symbols might invite censure. But beneath these outward signs lay the private reality of sorrow, of memory, of the quiet ways people sought to keep the bonds of love alive even after death. And through it all, the colonists continued to hope. For a good match, a healthy child, a long and peaceful marriage, a partner's steady hand through the hardships of life. These hopes, as fragile as they often proved, were the threads that wove together the fabric of their days. Part 10. The story of intimacy in Colonial America was in many ways the story of its people, shaped by hardship and hope, bound by duty and longing, and carried forward by the quiet, enduring search for connection in an uncertain world. As the colonies stood on the edge of revolution and changed the intimate lives of their inhabitants, remained woven into the daily struggle to survive, to build, and to belong, marriage, as it had always been, formed the bedrock of community and family. The ideal was clear: a union of man and woman, solemnized by church or magistrate, blessed by children, and anchored in shared work and mutual support. But the realities of marriage were often more complicated. Some couples found deep companionship, their bonds strengthened by years of labor, sorrow, and joy. Others endured tensions, disappointments, or betrayals, their hopes dimmed by the harsh demands of life or the failings of the human heart. Among those who never married, whether by choice, chance, or circumstance, life could be lonely, but also at times more independent. Single women, often called spinsters, sometimes lived with kin, lending their hands to household or farm work, helping to raise nieces and nephews. Others found work as midwives, school teachers, or shopkeepers, carving out a place in a world that expected them to marry. Single men might serve as farmhands, apprentices, or itinerant laborers, their lives less scrutinized than those of single women, but no less shaped by the expectations of their communities. Courtship remained a blend of public, ritual, and private. Hope. Young people met at church, at harvest gatherings, or through the matchmaking efforts of family and friends. Love, when it came, was often tempered by practical concerns, land dowries, alliances, but the desire for affection, for partnership, could not be ignored. Couples found ways to nurture connection: long walks, shared labors, stolen conversations in the hush of evening. The customs of the wedding day continued to reflect both solemnity and celebration. A modest feast, a gathering of neighbors, the blessing of clergy, these marked the start of a new household. The bride might wear a gown of her best dress, not necessarily new, and the couple might exchange simple bands of metal, symbols of the vows they had made. There was joy, of course, but also a deep sense of seriousness. Marriage was not merely a personal choice, but a commitment to the community and the future. In the marriage bed, the hopes of the family and the colony found their most intimate expression. A wife's fertility was both a blessing and a burden. Each pregnancy was welcomed with prayers for health and safety. Each birth attended by midwives and marked by the mingling of joy and fear. And with every child born, the ties of marriage grew deeper, the responsibilities heavier. But not every union produced children, and not every child survived. The harsh realities of disease, accident, and poverty shaped the lives of parents and their little ones. Families mourned together, comforted each other, and found strength in shared faith or in the simple act of enduring from one day to the next. Intimacy, outside of marriage, continued to be a source of both fascination and condemnation. The court records still tell of fines for fornication, public penance for adultery, and the occasional scandal that rocked a small town or village. Yet in the growing cities, as anonymity increased, the enforcement of these moral laws became more uneven. Taverns, inns, and busy streets offered opportunities for both connection and temptation, and not every lapse found its way to the notice of authorities. Among the enslaved, the struggle to preserve family life remained a quiet daily act of resistance. A man and woman who pledged themselves to each other, who raised children together, despite the ever-present threat of separation, demonstrated a courage and resilience that defied the cruelty of the system that sought to own them. Their marriages, unrecognized by law, were sanctified by love and by the shared determination to endure.